Thanks for having me. It's great to be back in New Hampshire. Before I get started, I have to quickly explain that introduction. We were told to do sort of staff biographies for our website, and I made a tongue-in-cheek reference about my spare time watching C-SPAN and researching obscure House races. That's only partially true. Although I do find myself increasingly spending way too much time watching C-SPAN though of late. Let me just say a word about New Hampshire, kind of what it means to be here. You folks, I'm sure every 4 years here, politicians come to the state and lavish the primary with praise and the unique role that folks in the granite state play, but I'm not looking for any votes, so you can take this as it is. It's a very neat place that holds, I think, an important place in the heart of the folks who are certainly in my business. Coming up here is always fun, even if it's not for the primary. It's just neat to be back here where people really take politics seriously. So thanks very much for having me. I want to talk for a little bit and then take questions and sort of have a little dialogue, which is sort of the New Hampshire way, and it's more fun for me too. I'm going to talk about the Republicans and get into it President Obama some, but I know Jennifer wants to sort of keep the focus on the Republicans. They had a terrible two cycles in 2006 and 2008, took bad losses, and I wrote after the election, I think this is true, they're probably in the weakest state that they've been since before the Reagan Revolution, which is going back nearly 30 years now. And that was, with the exception, I think, of Bill Clinton's first term, or first 2 years, that was when you last had Democrats in control of the White House and both chambers of Congress, which obviously you do now. So they're in a very, very weakened place. And Jennifer and I were talking before I came out here. I think it's tough to sort of define who they are and what they are right now. They're sort of going through an Admiral Stockdale moment. You guys remember Ross Perot's running mate, James Stockdale, who actually was a war hero and prisoner of war, but sadly is known historically for being a footnote as Ross Perot's running mate, who stood up there at the debate and said, "Who am I? Why am I here?" I think that there's some of that now among the Republicans, and especially in Congress. They, I think, are flattered by President Obama's outreach, and it's been considerable. He really has wined them and dined them nearly every day, either having them to the Oval Office, going to Capitol Hill, talking to them on the phone, cocktails, Super Bowl party, what have you. He's really reached out. So I think they are giving him a sort of honeymoon period to see if this is genuine and to see if they can work with this new president. And that happens with every new president, but I think it's especially unique in this one, given his proactive effort. But at a political level, and we're in New Hampshire, and there's politics here. He's a very popular president. They are a little bit, I think, scared to take him on right now because they don't want to suffer political payback. He is extraordinarily strong in the polls right now. There were some great numbers, I wish I had them in front of me, of people who voted against him in November and their approval of President Obama, and it sort of spiked upward from November. I'm not sure how much longer that will last, given the challenges that we face. But right now, he's in a very strong political place. The best evidence of this is if you watch the Republicans right now in Congress, that they train their fire almost entirely on Speaker Pelosi and Leader Harry Reid. They are so loath to openly go after President Obama. When they criticize the stimulus, it's always in the context of President Obama should talk to his leaders on Capitol Hill. So there is an effort to sort of confront the opposition, but to sort of try and make Reid and Pelosi the face of their party. And obviously there's politics in that too. Reid and Pelosi are far less popular than the president is right now. So I think that you're seeing the congressional wing of the party a bit unsure of itself right now as it applies to Obama. I don't think that applies to the party writ large. I think that nationally, the sort of base of the party, the conservatives, aren't terribly fond of President Obama and I think are scared of some of his policies. And I think the sort of voice of that wing of the party is Rush Limbaugh. And you've seen some back and forth between members of Congress and Rush Limbaugh, a very powerful figure in the GOP, as to just how much confrontation there should be with President Obama. So it's a party finding its way that it's more comfortable going after the president outside the Beltway than it is inside the Beltway. And I think this identity crisis stems in large part from the fact that they've been the party of Bush for the past 8 years. They didn't have an heir apparent. Cheney wasn't going to run. They settled on John McCain, but he was never really an establishment Republican. He was sort of a idiosyncratic Republican. So they were dominated by Bush even in 2008, in large part because the Democrats, reinforced the fact that it was John McCain on the ballot, but it was really George Bush that they were challenging the policies of. So it's this sort of first few months of the post-Bush era, and they're trying to figure out exactly who they are. I was on the Hill the day that President Obama came up there to talk to Republicans in the House and the Senate, to have lunch with them. It's been about 3 hours up there. Talked to a lot of Senate and House Republicans afterwards, and they were so flattered, and they were very, very impressed by him. And then they went out and they all voted against the stimulus bill, which I think sort of shows the limitations of personal courtship. They are willing to say nice things about President Obama, and they're hesitant to really confront him, but they're also not, I think, going to be rolled when it comes to sort of policy and some of these bills. And I think that's in large part because of the fact that there is a hesitance to spend more money and to, I think, go into more debt after the unpopularity in the grassroots of the party of the bailout last year. I think some of the Republicans who got behind that at the urging of the president and Harry Paulson have said sort of never again. And I think that's why you see some of that concern, and you saw that unanimous opposition to the stimulus bill, even after the president came up there the previous day. I think you'll see more Republicans vote for the final passage of the stimulus bill, which we should have here in the next few days, than voted for it originally, because it has been changed some and because they'll want to claim credit for some of the pork in there for their districts and their states. But I think you'll see pretty full-fledged opposition. And I think that also gets to the sort of state of the party. Many of them politically can take that vote and make it, it's a safe vote, because they come from districts that increasingly are fairly conservative, or states that are fairly conservative. This is a party that in the past few cycles has lost almost all of its members from the Northeast. I think that there are, I want to say, 3 members from New York State and none from New England. And I think when you've got a party that is predominantly Southern, Western, some in the Rust Belt, these districts are such that it's easier for them to vote against the bill that the president wants, even though he's a popular president. But again, I think you'll see more of them come around on final passage of that vote. The sort of first interesting move that they've made in this post-Bush era, I think, was electing Michael Steele as chairman of the RNC. I'm sure some of you followed that race. This sort of speaks to the weakness of the party, I think, in some ways, not Steele, but the sort of field that was running for chairman of the RNC. There were overtures to try and get sort of more high-profile national in name into the race, but I think there was no real interest among a Newt Gingrich or a Mitt Romney, more of a household name, to do that. And so they were left with, effectively, a group of party activists. And so I think they made the choice they did, in large part because I think Steele was perhaps the most skilled communicator, the most outspoken, most charismatic one in the bunch. But to be pretty frank about it, it was not the most impressive bunch out there. But I think that Steele is somebody who the party feels will be able to go out and take on Obama in a public way, but in a way that's not mean-spirited. Michael Steele, if you guys have seen him on cable news, is a sort of pretty genial guy, and I think that's sort of the hope. The previous chairman was not very TV-friendly at all, and so I think you rarely saw him on the airwaves. So I think Steele is somebody who will be better taking on the president on TV. I think where the party goes next will, I think, in large part be defined by the state of the economy and the popularity of President Obama. We were talking before this. about prospects for 2012, and even though it's 2009, that's not that far away. I think you're going to see a lot of folks watch this economy and see where it goes and see where President Obama's ratings are before they get into this race in 2012. If he is still where he is now, I think you'll see some people take a pass. If he looks vulnerable, I think you'll see more people in there. When Democrats have struggled, they have, as they did in the 80s, they sort of turned more towards the middle. The DLC became more of a prominent factor in the party. And of course, Bill Clinton famously came out of that. I don't think you're seeing the Republicans having real pains as far as their ideological. I mean, there are some more center-right Republicans, but it's still a conservative party, and I don't think that's going to change necessarily. I don't think you're going to see a big moderate movement or a moderate candidate in 2012, but I do think you'll see candidates who believe that you have to talk more about the issues of today with a conservative approach. You have to offer conservative solutions on issues like healthcare, education, energy, and those kind of things in a way that President Bush never really did that, and I think certainly Senator McCain wasn't able to in his campaign. I think the Republicans are very much looking towards their governors now. There's this sort of tradition when they are in tough shape to sort of turn back towards their governors. You saw that in the 90s during the Clinton presidency. There was that group of prominent Republican governors that then Governor Bush came out of in 98, 99. I think you'll see that certainly now. The folks that I would watch are Governor Tim Pawlenty in Minnesota, who I think is somebody you guys saw in New Hampshire during the last cycle as a McCain surrogate. I think he's looking at running. I think Governor Christ in Florida is someone who's very ambitious. He was with the president yesterday on stage in Florida as a governor with a bad budget deficit looking to get some funds for the stimulus. He was there. I think he will give it a look too. I think Bobby Jindal is somebody who a lot of conservatives are very high on, but he's 37 right now as the governor of Louisiana in his first term. My guess is that if the president is still popular, he will wait and run in 2016 when Vice President Biden will not be on the ticket, and it'll be basically an open race. And there are the folks who ran previously. I think Huckabee is going to give it a look again. I think Romney will as well. But I think that you will see a push to get, and certainly, obviously, Sarah Palin is somebody who a lot of folks in the party are looking to run, although I'm not sure that's a done deal by any means. So I think you'll see more of a sort of look back at the governors, which is sort of the tradition of the party. And let me just close before taking questions, talking a bit about President Obama and the sort of phenomenon, because he is really a phenomenon. And we were talking before this about when this sort of he's going to come back down to earth, if ever. There's still so much fascination about President Obama, and certainly we see it from our vantage point. And let me just give you a sort of an anecdote that I think sort of sums that up. I was with the president yesterday in Fort Myers, Florida, where he had his event, and not just was the crowd big, but it's sort of reminiscent of what I used to read about with previous presidents, like President Kennedy. Going from the airport in Fort Myers to the event, there were thousands of people lining the streets, like waving American flags and sort of looking at campaign signs. The kind of stuff that I think certainly happens with most presidents, but the sort of level of devotion, the passion, and just the pure volume of people, I think, is just different. And the event was, we're in February. It felt like it was October of the campaign. They're chanting, "Yes, we can," and they're still very much into it. So his numbers are still very strong. And I was struck by that. And then I got back on Air Force One. We're flying back to Washington, and almost, I think, half of the Democratic delegation of Congress from Florida was on the plane with him. And that's not uncommon, of course. But afterwards, when we were getting off the plane at Andrews Air Force Base, they were members of Congress. They were lining up and taking turns and taking pictures in front of Air Force One and in front of Marine One. And I think that sort of gets at just, how big of a deal the president is right now, that the members of this, of Congress, which is a co-equal branch of government, are sort of so in awe and almost starstruck by this president that they're doing that. And I think that gets to why the Republicans right now, to sort of come back to how I started, it gets to why the Republicans right now, at least in Congress, are hesitant about how to approach the president, how to take him on, if to do so at all, because he is right now so popular in the polls. And so they're in sort of a wait-and-see mode, which I think does diverge with the appetite of conservatives around the country who want to take him on more. So with that, let me wrap up and open it up for questions, and not just about Republicans, but the president, the primary here last time, and the primary next time. Any of the above. Red Sox, anything you guys got? A-Rod? Anything's fair game. Yes, sir.
The evangelicals today, post-election, they've changed a little bit. They've discovered the environment.
Yeah.
Social consciousness might be higher. Where do you see them today? Less powerful, more powerful? Should they? Do they need to be approached differently next time?
Great question. Spent a lot of time covering the Republican primary in a lot of parts of the country, and so I have a pretty good grasp for that. I still think overwhelmingly they will be supportive of the Republican Party. In large part, that's because of cultural issues, gay marriage, abortion. I think there is a generational issue at play there, though, in the sense that those that are under 40 may be more open to considering Democrats. I think some of them certainly voted for President Obama, but I think the ones that are older, I think, are more culturally attached to the Republican Party because they've been the party of anti-abortion, opposing gay rights. But yeah, some are sort of younger evangelicals. I think are willing to keep more of an open mind towards Democrats, but it's still going to be a challenge. You pick some of them off, I think it'll still be tough. But I think Obama, and this is one of the reasons why he won, and was just so smart about dulling edges. His entire political career has been about dulling edges, and his language is so careful, and he worked very, very hard to attract those kind of voters into his fold. There's a guy who works for him named Josh Dubois, who's 26 or 27, African American, part Pentecostal minister, part political operative, and that's true. And smart guy, and he is now going to be running the faith-based office, which President Bush created. They're keeping. And I've talked to him, and I mean, they are very shrewd about their outreach, and talking to the leader of the Southern Baptist Convention, who, goodness knows, is no fan of the Democratic Party, but making sure that these folks are at least kept in the loop. They have an open line. So I think President Obama will be able to do well, and did well with some of those voters. But again, I think it's more at the margins than it is the vast majority of them. And just because President Obama did it doesn't mean other Democrats could do it, for example, I think. Yes, sir.
Would Obama be where he is if it had not been for almost a complete, total love affair
Yeah.
by the big left-wing media, operating? I don't think so. In fact, I think what's so surprising
Yeah.
is that with the heavy-handedness
Yeah.
of the big media, came as close as he did.
Media bias comes up almost every time I speak. I think he would be where he is today because I think that he won in large part because there was a hunger by many in this country to bring in something new, and they were tired of the Republican approach to doing business, and I think it was a repudiation of President Bush. Look, was there a fascination by some in the media about a young African-American president with candidate with a good-looking family? Of course, but I would argue that there's a fascination with a good story by any reporter, and it doesn't have to necessarily be a liberal Democrat. You can cite examples, and I'm sure that there are valid ones out there, and I've heard about Bernie Goldberg's book, and you can find examples, but if you talk to the folks that actually covered President Obama, this is what's always fascinating to me, because this question does come up. There's this sort of notion that President Obama got great media coverage and the press loves him. If you talk to the folks that actually covered President Obama, there is not a love affair at all. He's actually sort of, in some ways, a pretty distant fellow. There was not some kind of personal relationship where he's taking an interest in you, and there's sort of this back and forth. That's not something that happens or happened. So I would take issue with your characterization. Did Senator McCain get some tough media coverage? Absolutely, he did. He ran a flawed campaign, and I think even his operatives would admit that. And it was a campaign that had leaks, that had folks who weren't necessarily loyal to the principle. And so I think that, there was more fodder than for tough coverage. So I think President Obama would be where he is. I think you can find examples of certainly bias, and he's on quite a few magazine covers, which doesn't hurt as far as selling magazines. But I think that there were much larger forces at play than whether or not MSNBC was in love with President Obama. And I think also the media is changing. People get so caught up with TV news, and people will point to Keith Olbermann or Chris Matthews. Well, they aren't doing reporting day in, day out. They're commentating on somebody else's reporting and opining on the news of the day. They aren't out there covering press conferences, going to events, traveling to New Hampshire to talk to sources and actually break news. They are, sitting in a TV studio and they're sort of talking about the news. But because TV is TV and it is so powerful, folks look at those commentators and think that somehow represents the media, when there are folks actually out there that are dispassionate about who's winning or who's losing and just want to get to the truth and get to actually what's going on in politics. So I think you can't totally judge things on sort of TV news, even though TV news has become such a powerful force.
Hi, how are you? First of all, I'm a Democrat.
Yeah, good to see you again. Yeah.
So I have a bias.
You were here last time I was here.
That's right. I'm a fan. How's that?
Thank you.
And I pick up your bias against Chris Matthews and those guys. Maybe you out there working in the field as much as you are.
I have huge respect for Chris Matthews, who's been in politics for a very, very long time, who has written a fantastic book about politics. Actually, Chris Matthews sort of rose to fame in large part because of his writing. I'm talking about print journalism versus TV journalism. Chris Matthews wrote a book called Hardball, which if you guys haven't read, I highly commend it to you. Fantastic insider's account of how politics really works behind the scenes, and it's a superb book. And I read it when I was in college and just loved it. So no, Chris is a super smart guy, but I just think my concern is that folks who try and judge media bias or leaning to the left or the right based upon TV news commentators instead of day in, day out reporters. Sure. Please go ahead.
Now my question is, we have a neighbor who is a very sharp guy and has been a lifelong Republican, and he categorizes himself as a moderate Republican.
Right.
And we were over his house at the election. He said, I have no home in the Republican Party anymore. And I really felt badly for him. And I really thought about what he said. And it's really true, because it seems like that hardcore base seems to be running the party, and they're more interested in what they're not for than what they are for.
Right.
They know what they're against,
right,
but I don't think they've really delineated what they're for.
Yeah.
And I feel bad for these guys, and I do think there is if somebody can come up and be a moderate Republican, I think they have a really strong chance to upset a guy like Obama, because Americans aren't really comfortable with nationalizing banks and things like that. I mean, I understand we're in a really big crisis here, but if you had a moderate Republican, I think he would have or she would have a very strong voice now.
It would be tough for them to survive the primary process, which typically does favor conservatives, though. But to your point about being against something instead of being for something, I did a large story after the election, talked to a lot of Republicans about where the party should go, and one of the refrains that I heard over and over again was, we have to be for something. We have to have conservative solutions to the problems of the 21st century, which are the issues that I mentioned previously. And I think, there's a way that's possible. You can't just be screaming the other guy's a socialist and likes terrorists and wants to raise your taxes. I mean, I think those things work in a certain environment, but other times, like last year, people want to know, look, I'm getting laid off. I can barely pay the mortgage. My health premium is going through the roof. They have kitchen table issues that they want addressed. Now, sometimes those kitchen table issues are, my taxes are skyrocketing. My goodness, I'm going to pay for welfare, and there's terrible crime. I am barely safe at night. I think those are obviously issues that would favor Republicans more, but the kitchen table issues, I think now do tend to historically at least favor Democrats. And so you talk to a Bobby Jindal or a Tim Pawlenty or in Congress, someone like Paul Ryan or Eric Keener or these young up-and-coming Republicans, like, look, you know, we can be against taxes, certainly guns, abortion, gay marriage, that kind of thing. But you have to have some kind of solution that, look, we're not for universal health care. We don't want the government running healthcare, state healthcare. But this is what we're for, and this is why it's going to work, and this is why it's better. And I think that you didn't see a lot of that in the past 8 years, and you'll see, I think, at least more of it from the Republicans here in the years ahead. But again, it's going to be tough because President Obama is a very savvy politician. It was no mistake that he went to Indiana and Florida for his first trips. Yes, those are states that have been hard hit by the economy, and yes, Elkhart and Fort Myers are two cities that have been really hard hit, but they also happen to be pivotal political states. Indiana, nobody thought he'd win. It was probably the most surprising state that he won. Hadn't gone for a Democrat, I believe, since LBJ in '64. It was shocking, and it meant a lot to his folks. And I think that's part of the reason why he went there. You know, Florida is Florida. It's a pivotal. Let me just make one other point, because I was going to make it during my remarks, but I forgot to. The stimulus package, I mean, I do think is important at a political level because it carries enormous risk and reward for both sides. And the president mentioned some of this yesterday, a very candid moment in his Fort Myers town hall meeting. He said, look, if this, people are going to judge me based upon whether or not we're successful, and they're going to hold me accountable as to whether things improve. And obviously, he's talking about the economy. If they don't, they're going to vote me out and put somebody else in there, which you don't often hear from politicians, especially those who are a grand total of, I think, 3 weeks into their first term. But it's pretty stark that his first term will be defined by this economy, I think, in large part, God forbid, other outside events. And so I think that if this doesn't work, and if the Republican opposition is vindicated, then you will see Republicans next year in a place like Democrats were in 2006. Not necessarily voted in because they were beloved at the moment, but because they were not the other guy. So I think the Democrats and the president recognize that they're going to be held accountable for this stimulus package, almost $1 trillion. And if it doesn't work and we're still where we are or worse next year, I think it could create a more favorable climate for Republicans, not necessarily because of anything that they did or said, but just because of the failure of the folks who were running the place. At the same time, if it does work and the economy does come back, Democrats will have an opportunity to paint Republicans as the party of no, these sort of neo-Hooverites. I was talking to one Democratic strategist who was licking his chops almost at the prospect of the ads he was going to run against the House Republicans next year, who voted no on the stimulus package. President Obama was trying to help the economy in hard times, and these Republicans stood in the way and voted no. That's a pretty tough ad. So I think it's sort of a high wire act and could carry much more so than any piece of legislation we've seen in recent years. Perhaps going back to the Clinton budget in '93, where a lot of Republicans won based upon the tax increases in '94, a piece of legislation that could have profound effects politically in the midterms and also in 2012. What's next? Yes.
In the Obama, win this year, the youth factor was pretty significant. A lot of youth definitely came out to vote, and I wasn't so much for the Republicans. And I'm wondering, amongst the Republican leaders that you talked about, if that's even a concern of theirs.
Absolutely.
And if they want to put forward somebody who's going to capture that youthful spirit.
Absolutely.
And I don't think just appeals to youth. It appeals to everyone.
Yeah, sure, because President Kennedy didn't just win the kids. I mean, he was somebody who I think appealed to a lot of folks because there is a tradition in this country. I mean, we like people who are young and vigorous and have young families, sort of are alive. I think that certainly helped the president, well, not just young folks, but also all ages. It is a concern of a lot of Republicans. if you follow this RNC race closely, and I know it's kind of an inside game, but if you follow the RNC race closely, there was a lot of talk about what are we going to do technologically to catch up. And that's basically, the translation of that is, how are we going to attract kids? How are we going to get on Facebook and use Twitter and IM and that kind of thing and try and get them back? And I think there is concern about that, and they're trying to figure out a way to appeal to younger people. McCain, I think, had a tough time, not just because of his age, but because, the fact that he didn't use email, I think, just symbolically was stunning to a lot of folks who were under 30, who is a fundamental part of their life. I mean, I'm 32. I didn't have email when I was in high school, had it in college, but nowadays, if you're 30 or under, you were growing up with email. You were growing up with instant messaging, and it's essential. And the president, to not be able to use that is, I think, a pretty jarring thing. So it's something that's talked about, but it's mostly talked about as far as the means and the sort of process. There hasn't been a sort of big conversation about how do we have to frame issues to appeal to young folks. And I think that is a conversation that still is needing to take place. I mean, issues like climate change, and which are more important to younger folks. I think the party's got to figure out a way to sort of talk about those things. Please.
Who do you think they could put forward, though? Like, I mean, I know
Yeah.
there's a lot of talk about Sarah Palin.
Yeah.
Sort of, but I don't know if she really appeals to a lot of people.
I think it depends upon the young person. I mean, I think she has the potential to appeal to young folks, and especially young women who are more conservative, who want to be involved in politics and have families at the same time. Or I think, Jindal is somebody who I think you need to watch. I think Tim Pawlenty, certainly. I think he's 46 or 47, I want to say. Jindal is 37. There are some folks in the Congress, too. Paul Ryan, I think, is a really impressive guy. He's a member of Congress in the House from Wisconsin. I think wants to run for governor or senator at some point here soon. I think he's someone who I think would be very, very impressive down the line. But, to be brutally honest, the party is now at a low ebb. I mean, I think, like I said previously, going back to before the Reagan Revolution, the bench is pretty thin, and I think that's a result of 2 consecutive tough elections. I think politics in America, goodness knows, comes in cycles, and I think they're just at sort of a tough cycle, which isn't to say that can't change pretty fast, but I think for right now, they're sort of looking for the next phase of the party, and there's no better evidence for this than the constant talk about Ronald Reagan. I was thinking about it before I came out. I mean, he was elected president in 1980. That's almost 30 years ago, and so they're trying to figure out not just who they are post-Bush, but also still post-Reagan. So it's going to take some time. But again, like I said previously, they could be helped in the process by the failure of Democrats. Yes, they got to define themselves, but they could have a little boost if Democrats who have the total run of the place can improve the economy. They're going to be held accountable for that, and that could help sort of galvanize the Republican resurgence.
Jonathan, I'd be curious. You were talking about the stimulus bill and whether that bill, from what you can tell, came from the House Democrats or from Obama.
Yeah, it's a great question.
And why there's been so little reporting on it.
Yeah.
I mean, are people being shut out of that process?
It's a great question, and I think that part of the reason that Obama didn't get a single House Republican vote was because of the PR job. I think the Democrats and Obama have not fared well in selling this bill and have let some conservatives and some Republicans sort of define the bill by picking out some of these obviously and glaringly extraneous portions of it. I'm thinking about money to resod the National Mall, money in there for contraceptives. I mean, those kind of things came to define the bill, at least in some quarters, and I think that has hurt the sort of salesmanship of the bill, and I think has made it more of a tougher road. And that's why the president has had to get engaged in more personal diplomacy. He had Senators Collins, Snow, and Specter to the White House for half an hour apiece. I mean, he's having to roll his sleeves up more in a way because the sort of PR element of the bill, I think, could have been handled better. And they won't say it publicly, but I think privately, you know, there is some grousing among Obama loyalists that the congressional Democrats weren't helpful in crafting this bill. You know, Obama talks about change, but Congress never changes. I mean, Congress is full of strong egos. It's full of folks who have constituencies and loyalties that are utterly irrelevant to whoever's in the White House. They were there long before he got there, and many of them will be there long after he's gone. And if they have an opportunity to pass nearly $1 trillion spending bill, then guess what? They're going to get some money in there for their personal, you know, priorities or sort of interest or hobby horses. And
Even Chris said that, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think you saw that happen. And the Republicans shrewdly picked out some of the more, I think, non-sellable sort of, you know, elements that just were clearly not going to boost the economy and we're not going to create jobs, and sort of use that to try and define the bill and made it tougher. So it's been kept mostly behind closed doors, but I think there is some frustration that some of these old bulls, especially in the House, pushed through this bill and had stuff in there that if the Obama staff had their choice would have never put in the bill, and sort of made it a tougher sell for them. At the same time, I think some in Congress would have preferred to have seen the president take a more active role in writing the bill. Dianne Feinstein, the senior Democrat from California, said, you know, this is a lesson for the president that he needs to, you know, next time take a more active role in writing the bill, because when you let Congress have basically a free hand in crafting the details of it, they're going to do what Congress does. And I think that has hurt the salesmanship of it, even though it is now looking like it's going to pass here in the next few days. So that's always a struggle for any president, is sort of how much leeway to give to Congress and how much to sort of take on your own. And Obama, you know, uniquely has it right now because of the fact that his party controls the House and the Senate. So it's going to be one of the more fascinating stories to watch, is how he gets along with the congressional wing of his party. A lot of Republicans complain about President Bush because he didn't curb the excesses of the congressional wing of his party. Spending is the complaint that you hear most often among conservatives. We spend too much damn money. We spent like drunken sailors, McCain would always say. And I think that gets to what I'm saying now. You had a Republican majority in the House and Senate and a Republican president, but he was loath to sort of take them on and veto spending bills because he wanted them on other issues like the war, like, you know, his priorities. And so he let them sort of, you know, get away with earmarks and spending in a way that politically, I think, hurt the Republican brand.
My follow-up to that really quickly, too,
Please.
is you had said earlier, you know, if the Republicans don't support a bill, if Obama fails in this, do you think that's a realistic possibility? Because it seems to me that now going into the conference process, then reconciliation, and then both houses voting, it's hard for me to imagine the Republicans not just putting some markers in the sand, getting what they need out of it, and then voting for it, unless the House Democrats are going to be incredibly bullish about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the final price tag of the agreement today was just under $800 billion, $798, something like that. I have every expectation that you will see some House Republicans support the bill on final passage. I'm not sure how many more Senate Republicans they'll get beyond the three, Collins, Snow, and Specter, although they may get a few, or a handful. But look, you have to keep in mind, in the House especially, members come from districts that voted for President Bush by 60% and over. It's a safe vote to vote no. There's not the downside that for a Jeb Bradley, a Charlie Bass would have faced wrath back home if they had opposed the bill and sort of stood in the way of a popular president at a time when people want action on the economy. So I think it's an easier no vote, even on final passage. Although I think you'll see some come over. But I think they feel like we spent so much money last fall on the bailout, and that enough's enough, and they're not going to enable a Democratic president the way they did their own last fall. Yes, sir.
Based on his tax issues, were you as astonished as I was astonished?
Yeah.
Timothy Geithner could be confirmed by the margin that he was confirmed, and I guess
Yeah.
this is great because I really don't have to worry about my taxes this year.
I think you still do. Although Marion Barry, God love him, as Joe Biden would say, the mayor for life of Washington, D.C., as they say, we found out, I think this is now the 8th year out of the past 9 that he didn't pay his taxes. So we're watching that with interest in Washington. I was a little bit surprised there was not more Republican pushback on Geithner, but this gets to my larger point tonight that I'm speaking about. There is this hesitation among Republicans as to how to approach this president. It's like an 8th grade school dance, you know, when there's the guys are on one side of the room and the girls are on the other, and there's the punch bowl's in the middle, and they're sort of like awkwardly walking over to the punch bowl, but scared to say hello and looking at the floor. I mean, there's just this sort of uncertainty as to how to deal with him because he is so damn popular, and because there is this feeling that the country wants some element of unity right now to restore the economy. And I think that translates in even to these appointments. And not just Geithner, who passed, I think it was like 65-35, even though he didn't pay his taxes for a few years. Look at Daschle. Daschle, on Friday night, the news of Daschle's tax problems came out. I worked the story that weekend. I was emailing, conservative Republicans and trying to get some kind of reaction. I mean, you couldn't make up a better, if you're a conservative and you're trying to caricature Democrats as limousine liberals, so to speak, you couldn't write a better sort of ad, right, than the sort of Daschle story if you were a Republican. And I had one conservative, Republican Senate aide say, on the record or off the record, he's a Democratic appointee. You work for a conservative from a red state. I mean, what's holding you back? But there is this hesitation as to how to confront him. And I think Daschle ultimately went, not necessarily because of the Republican criticism, because there wasn't that much of it, because the media reporting and sort of the scrutiny, of Daschle, and there was going to be more reporting, I think, to come on Daschle, and that they pulled the plug. But it wasn't because there was outrage among Hill Republicans. I think it's been muted. And I think that explains why Geithner got through and why he basically was grandfathered in.
I really don't get it. I mean, this is the smartest guy in the room.
Right.
He's Secretary of Treasury.
Right.
And he did what he did.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just absurd.
Apparently this has happened at the IMF among people. The backstory is he worked for the IMF, and there's some convoluted tax issue there. And he didn't pay his taxes, I think, for 4 years. Okay, it wasn't convoluted. Okay, right. And he basically wasn't held accountable for that by the Republicans. So, I think it had happened before the inaugural, when Obama had even more goodwill than he has right now. And he was able to sort of skate in. I think Daschle was partially a victim of when his scandal happened, because it happened after Geithner. And I think that one was okay, but I think that you saw a little bit more aggression in the coverage of it, certainly, after Geithner, because of Daschle's timing, and because it happened after the inaugural, too. So I don't have a great answer for you besides to say that if the Republicans had raised more hell on the Hill, maybe it wouldn't have happened. But it was pretty muted, and the Democrats up there wanted to help out the president. Although I think there were 3 or 4 Democrats in the Senate. I think Tom Harkin, Bernie Sanders, Harkin voted against it. But it's part of this honeymoon, I guess. Yes, sir.
How does that, is it true that the census was taken out of the Commerce Department and put into the hands of Rahm Emanuel?
Yeah. I'm not sure exactly what has become the final resolution on that. I know what you're talking about. There was some talk that obviously the president, and I can't believe I haven't mentioned this yet, I'm in New Hampshire talking about politics, and we haven't talked about Judd Gregg yet. But there was some talk after the president appointed Judd Gregg as Commerce Secretary that one of the functions of the Department of Commerce, which is to oversee the census, which obviously is coming up next year, would have been taken out of his department because of the fact he's a Republican, and there would have been concerns about him overseeing that and placed in the White House. I'm not sure if that's been decided on as to whether or not that's actually going to happen, but that's actually an issue where you have seen Republicans be very aggressive in speaking up on the Hill about that, trying to ensure that that doesn't happen. So I'm not sure that there's been a final resolution there. Yes, sir. Sure.
The gentleman's point about Republican moderates.
Right.
What makes a Republican a moderate?
Right.
I've noticed that one never sees a Republican in the media described as a moderate who is not pro-choice.
Right.
So I guess in the Republican Party, if you believe in preserving or reestablishing the legal protections for prenatal life,
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
thousands of years in countries, civilized countries since then, you can't be a moderate.
Mm-hmm.
If you insist that the right to kill babies in the womb is a constitutional right discovered in 1973
Mm-hmm.
by the Supreme Court, you're a moderate. The other
Sure.
that I like to
Sure.
call the Reagan Revolution.
Yeah.
I assume you mean it was a revolution from the right, a conservative revolution. I'll give you the falling of the Soviet Union. But you look at, tripling of deficits and doubling of national debt.
All right.
Supreme Court amendments like economy.
Right. All right.
But, it's a revolution written in sand, as far as I
Yeah.
don't see anything lasting.
That's why I love New Hampshire, because it really is a state full of independent-minded people, and even the Republicans or the more center-right folks are skeptical about Reagan after these years. It's sort of heartening to hear that. I won't sort of indulge the question about Reagan. I'll leave that to historians as to whether or not his legacy is one of conservatism, or whether or not that's sort of inflated and ignores his tax increases and his appointment of O'Connor. But let me though take up your first question. I think that's an important one. I do think that there is some truth to that this sort of tag of moderate can be a euphemism at times for supporting abortion rights. I don't think that always applies, though, and let me give you an example. I think Peter King, who is one of the few Republicans left in the Congress from the Northeast, he's from Long Island, represents overwhelmingly Italian and Irish district, a blue collar, a lot of cops and firefighters. I would call him a moderate Republican, and he certainly is anti-abortion. I mean, I think that there are less, but there still are sort of working class, Republicans who are more moderate, but certainly are opposed to abortion. I think it's a diminished sort of part of the party, but I think it's certainly still there. I think you see that in places like Long Island, where you have a heavily Catholic population.
Maybe I have a sort of Judge question.
Yeah, it's about time. Waiting for the.
Well, I was just wondering what your impression of the speed of light dealing with Senate replacement
Right.
was here in New Hampshire. You didn't even hardly have time to report on it.
Right.
But the Treasury Secretary seemed not as confident when he made his presentation, and there's been a lot of writing about how there's some differences of opinion within his own cabinet. And what I'm getting to,
Right.
do you see any strong cabinet members that might, bring forth their ideas in a stronger way? And that's what leads me to my question.
Please.
Greg, is he just going to disappear?
Yeah.
We'll see him again, or?
It's a good question, and I think during that 3 or 4 day period when we were trying to figure out if it was going to happen or not, I heard some of that from Republicans. This is like, it not only is this a sort of B-list gig, it's just sort of a second-tier cabinet post, but is he even going to be prominent? Is he going to be relevant at all? It was sort of viewed as a capstone of sorts. You get a Commerce Secretary position. You do it for 2 or 3 years, and then you retire, and you were the honorable, XYZ in the XYZ administration, like a lot of folks in Washington. And I think that there is some concern about that when it comes to Senator Gregg and whether or not he'll actually play a pivotal role. To your broader point, I think it's good. When I actually wrote a story a few weeks back about this, and that is that. Increasingly, the cabinets of modern American presidents have become more playing the role of implementers and less devisers. And that is to say, they run their departments, they implement the policies, but I think where the action is increasingly, where policies are made and where decisions are made is largely the White House, and it's the White House staff. There are exceptions to that, certainly, but I think that when you're talking about the economy and talking about some of these issues, I mean, it's coming from folks like Rahm Emanuel, the chief of staff to the president, Larry Summers, head of the National Economic Council. These are the folks that are playing pivotal roles. And I think it's certainly Geithner is very, very involved, and I think Treasury is a little bit different because Treasury is sort of different level. But when it comes to issues like energy, for example, or the environment, those policies will be set by, I think, folks that are closer to the White House or the West Wing, and not really left to the cabinet. And I think the Clinton years and the Bush years, you certainly saw that. You had cabinet secretaries that were largely anonymous. Even political junkies couldn't probably name some of the folks that were cabinet secretaries in the past couple of presidents. And I think that's because they don't have the sort of influence that perhaps they once did. In doing my story, I had a great quote. Perhaps shouldn't repeat here on college campus, but the quote was, "The only people who believe in cabinet and government are political scientists," which is just to say that it's sort of an antiquated thing that it doesn't really take place anymore. Yes, sir. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
By bigger and bigger government spending, which of course, it might, that's a different.
Well, I mean, I think
the Ayn Rand effect
I think that
to come into play is somewhere down the road.
I think that's part of the reason why you saw the opposition of a lot of folks in the House to the stimulus package, because they are content to oppose it and believe that it's excessive and not going to be effective, and then the responsibility will be tagged on the president and Democrats. So I mean, I think that's sort of the role that they're playing out. But ultimately, you can't just be the opposition party. You have to sort of put out a message, and I think that that's what a lot of folks in the party believe, that you have to field candidates that are articulately talking about sort of the challenges the country is facing and offering conservative solutions for them, and especially as it applies to president. I mean, yeah, you can run against Obama if he's not popular, but you have to also say what you're going to do as well. Yes, sir.
Well, I was thinking about Geithner and Judge Gray. From what I've read, I mean, both sides of the aisle were very much in favor of Geithner.
Yeah.
Whenever they said who should be the Treasury Secretary,
Yeah.
almost everybody said Geithner.
Right.
Did he make a foolish error? Yeah. But I think they looked at a guy like that
Yeah.
and said, he is the go-to guy.
Right.
Everybody's
Right.
consensus is he's the go-to guy.
Yeah.
He's having trouble bringing people in from Wall Street.
Right.
That's what they were hoping, that he was going to be able to bring in these deal makers.
Right.
But they're not interested in going to Washington, D.C. right now because
Right.
they're persona non grata.
Right. That was the argument, that he is somebody who is qualified in a unique fashion for this job, and we can't delay in these times appointing a Treasury Secretary. I think he benefited from that argument, but I think he benefited even more, among Republicans at least, from this desire to let Obama have his honeymoon and have the people that he wants. And again, keep in mind when this took place. It happened before he was even sworn in. So I think he benefited from the timing of it. The argument that you get to, that he was qualified for, that he could do this job, and that it was a pivotal job. It was not just some sort of second-tier backwater, but dealing with these very consequential issues right now. I think those factors together explain why he got confirmed like he did.
We have time for one final question. If anyone, particularly anyone who hasn't had a chance yet, has a question.
Yeah. Now it's going to be a hard ball.
No. Go ahead. No, this is a timely topic.
Yeah.
Republicans now. We could have had the same conversation now 2 years ago, after the 2007
Yeah.
And as parties try to find their way, primaries are one way that they can sort of
Right.
decide, figure out who they are. And we saw in the last Republican primary that you covered so extensively
Yeah.
this sort of struggle with
Right.
good candidates that represent
Yeah.
their wings of the party.
Right.
But now we find ourselves still scratching our heads. So did the last presidential primary for Republicans,
Right.
did it solve anything in terms of this internal identity crisis?
Yeah, I think it may have affected 2012 in this way. And before I answer the question, let me just say, I feel better now that I've come to New Hampshire and got at least one primary question. And I was asking before I started speaking about that, I said, have the candidates for next time started getting, not yet. I think February of 09, even for New Hampshire, it's a little bit too soon. You know, I think it's a good question. In Iowa, which you're very familiar with, you're going to see a hesitation among some Republicans to participate in the Iowa caucuses. I think New Hampshire has nothing to worry about in 2012. If I was giving this talk tonight in Des Moines instead of Manchester/Goffstown, I would be very blunt with them. I think you're going to see Republicans skip Iowa next time if Huckabee or Palin run, and for this reason. The caucuses are different than the primary. Primary, anybody can vote, and you can pick the side. Doesn't matter which party you're in. You know, it's more of a party affair in the caucuses in Iowa, and the party out there is more culturally conservative. And I think because Huckabee is somebody who nobody really gave a shot until the very end. And then even then, there was uncertainty among the party establishment. And he won the caucuses by 8 points. It wasn't even close. And I think that candidates will take a hard look at 2012 if Huckabee is running again. They may cede the state to him. If Palin, the same thing. I mean, if she looks formidable among the base of the party, then they may not even bother. You know, Rudy proved you can't skip everything at the start. But I think maybe you can pick one state to not play in, although I think it's still dangerous. But I think they're going to be watched very closely. If Romney does run again, I know a lot of people who like Romney who will strongly urge him to not spend a day in Iowa if Huckabee is in the race, because you know why go through that again? So I think it sort of has shaped it in that way. More broadly, you know, I still think it'll be tough for a moderate Republican to come out and win the nomination of the party. It's still a conservative party, and even more so in the primary process. You know, I saw Charlie Crist yesterday. He's probably the most high-profile, moderate-ish Republican. I say ish because he's sort of tough to really define, but he's probably the most high-profile, moderate Republican, or center-right Republican, I should say, that would run in 2012. And I think he would have a tough time in Iowa. And he comes from a big state that's pivotal in every presidential race. He's a charismatic guy and very popular at home, and he's probably going to win re-election next year by a wide margin, depending upon the economy at least. And, you know, it's tough to see him winning the Iowa caucuses, darn tough, and it's tough to see him winning the New Hampshire primary, too. You know, John McCain, I think, did well here, not necessarily because he was a moderate, but he was iconoclastic. He was New Hampshire, you know. I mean, he fit the state more. He was a reformer, too. I mean, he just was more simpatico with the state, but it wasn't because he was a moderate necessarily. I mean, back to your question, I mean, John McCain has opposed abortion rights throughout his entire congressional career. So I think it's tough on their side. You know, as far as Democrats go, I still think the liberal base of the party carries a lot of sway. Obama was so talented last year. He was able, like I said, like dull every edge. I mean, the liberal base of the party liked him, even though he was not necessarily giving them everything that they wanted, and certainly isn't now. But he's able to sort of transcend that because of his personal skills, just like Reagan did certainly with the conservatives because of his personal skills. Well, he raised taxes and he pointed O'Connor to the bench. Well, he's Reagan, it's okay, but just because they sort of outsized personalities that they can transcend those kind of things.